Yet what happens when, residing in such a family, you one day unexpectedly feel like an outsider? So much of an outsider that they are willing to dispose of you through the most intricate means. Before you stands a typical American family, dedicating all their spare time to the church's service. Those familiar with the Stouts always had high praise for them. Individuals sought to support them both materially and spiritually. However, to everyone's astonishment, it was later uncovered that the family concealed a horrific secret. Among the devoted followers resided a malevolent entity, which was miraculously halted in its tracks. Diana and Mark Stout had cherished each other since their youth, eager to finish high school to begin their lives together. They wed at a tender age, acquired a quaint house in Springfield, Missouri, and welcomed 4 children. Diana, a skilled nurse, also played the organ at the Lutheran church. Mark, on the other hand, was the lead vocalist and guitarist for a local blues band called A Game with Fate, which struggled to gain popularity and financial success. Mark sporadically worked as a bartender, much to Diane's dismay, as the family was in dire financial straits. Diana bore the financial brunt, struggling to provide and care for everyone at home. The couple's strained marriage was further burdened by their 2 children's special needs. 9-year-old Brianna faced learning difficulties, and 26-year-old Sean was autistic. The financial pressure slightly eased when their eldest daughter Sarah left for college, reducing the household expenses. However, upon her return, jobless and laden with student debt, the financial strain intensified. Then there was Rachel, the cherished daughter, who excelled academically, had a flair for music and poetry, and was learning French. Diana openly favored Rachel, often bragging about her accomplishments or praising her on social media. Life for the Stouts was a struggle but unremarkable until Easter Sunday, April 8, 2012, when 61-year-old Mark unexpectedly died. Diana informed the police that Mark had been sick for days, but had stubbornly refused medical attention, despite her offers of help as a nurse. Returning from rehearsal, Mark felt ill and chose to rest. Diana, respecting his need for quiet, proceeded to church that evening without disturbing him. The following day, when Mark failed to emerge from the bedroom, she checked on him, only to discover he was not breathing. His bandmates had remarked on his ill appearance at rehearsal. Although Mark was able to perform, he occasionally seemed to be in painful confusion, appeared extremely fatigued, and his skin exhibited a yellowish hue. Mark's health had always been fragile, leading the other band members to overlook his deteriorated condition. Mark's demise was deemed natural, with no inquiry into the specifics, attributed to his lifestyle, which frequently involved alcohol. His friends and family were saddened by his death. However, they observed Diana's relatively calm demeanor at the cremation. Diana explained that both she and Mark had faced serious illnesses frequently. They had accepted that eventually one of them might not survive, mentally preparing for the possibility, which softened the impact of Mark's death for them compared to others. Following Mark's death, Diana received a $20,000 life insurance payout and relocated to a larger, more attractive house in a different neighborhood with her children. At the time, Brianne was 9 and had a learning disability. Sean was 26, Sarah, an unemployed college graduate, was 24, and the favored daughter, Rachel, was 22. Mark's passing was not the sole misfortune to befall the Stout family in 2012. Shortly after the patriarch's death, the family of 5 was reduced to 4 when Diana discovered her eldest son, Sean, dead on his bedroom floor, in the bloom of his youth. Diana reported to the police that Sean had been displaying symptoms akin to a severe cold or flu, including diarrhea, nausea, body aches, and fever for about 3 weeks. He also suffered from headaches and, according to his mother, experienced seizures during periods of amnesia. The presence of dried blood around Sean's mouth raised questions among the police as to why Diana, a nurse aware of his worsening condition, had not sought hospital care or called for a doctor. Diana's justification that her son had refused hospital treatment and she did not want to coerce him due to his adulthood struck them as peculiar for a concerned parent. Sean's passing, much like his father's, was deemed natural, and once more, Observers noted the mother's apparent indifference towards the calamity. When a neighbor spotted the medical examiner's vehicle in the driveway, he went over to Diana to inquire about the situation. Diana responded quite casually that her son had passed away that day. She showed no emotional response. Her demeanor was not reminiscent of a bereaved mother mourning the loss of her offspring, despite him being of adult age. Even more peculiar was her conduct following her son's burial. Diana didn't arrange any commemorative service for Sean. No death notice was published in his honor, as if his memory merited no acknowledgement. The young man was simply incinerated, and existence proceeded as though he had never been a part of the Stout household. In 2013, the Springfield Police Department was tipped off by an unnamed source who claimed to be intimately familiar with Diana and her household. This informant hinted at a deeply troubling aspect concerning the recent deaths, alleging Diana had deceived law enforcement. Both deceased individuals were discovered with desiccated blood near their necks, experiencing eerily similar ends, which seemed far from coincidental. During this period, one of Diana's daughters, 24-year-old Sarah, fell critically ill at home, despite having no prior health issues, necessitating a thorough investigation by the authorities. Sarah began to show symptoms identical to those of her father and brother, including acute bodily aches, with her condition deteriorating rapidly. Diana relocated Sarah to Sean's former bedroom, fearing that if Sarah were to pass away in her own room, it would become unlivable for others. Previously, Rachel had used Sean's room but was tormented by nightmares. This time, however, Diana chose to hospitalize her daughter. The hospital diagnosis was grim, revealing multiple organ failures and the onset of shutdown, alongside of cerebral hemorrhage, placing Sarah in intensive care under life support. Despite the dire circumstances, Diana's lighthearted attitude towards her daughter's critical state, including making light remarks about not allowing the illness to interfere with her upcoming Florida vacation, struck the medical team as odd. Her indifference suggested a chilling possibility that Sarah's condition might have been intentionally caused. The anonymous tip grew increasingly credible as all medical examinations to pinpoint the illness came back inconclusive, compelling detectives to reinterrogate Diana about her involvement. Diana presented herself with a questioning with remarkable composure, displaying neither remorse nor anxiety. In an effort to put her at ease and encourage openness, the officers started with queries she had faced before. Throughout the conversation, they sensed she was either concealing something significant or engaging in deliberate falsehoods. The moment Diana offhandedly mentioned antifreeze, the investigators perked up, pressing her for details. Stott then astonishingly asserted that Mark and Sean had both taken their own lives by ingesting antifreeze. The detectives, seizing on this, suggested that Sarah might have emulated her brother and father's actions. They posited that Diana's forthrightness could not only potentially save her daughter, but also dispel any lingering doubts. Contrary to expectations, Diana quickly crumbled, delivering a chilling admission. The inception of Diana and her favored 22-year-old daughter Rachel's sinister plans began during a conversation about how much easier life would be without their familial troubles. They fantasized about a life devoid of Mark, who was seen as a burden to Diana, Sean, whose autism led to challenging behaviors, Sarah, who accumulated college debt that the family had to cover, and finally, Brianne, who struggled with a learning disability. The notion of removing these burdens from their lives transitioned from a mere jest to serious consideration and ultimately to meticulous planning. The duo deliberated over various methods to discreetly eliminate the family members they deemed problematic, labeling them as detriments to their well-being. Their overarching goal was to ensure any action taken was both silent and untraceable. The decision to take Sarah to the hospital was driven by Diana's desire to avoid the unpleasant odors associated with in-house death. As they plotted, suffocation, an assortment of pills, and other means were considered before they settled on antifreeze for its simplicity, cleanliness, and low suspicion level as their method of choice. Their preparation phase included online research for antifreeze that lacked the typical bitter taste, to ensure their scheme remained undetected. They eventually found and purchased a tasteless variant online, solidifying their plan. Diana's grievances extended beyond the financial burdens imposed by her husband. She was also fed up with his volatile temper and lethargy. The love that once existed between them had deteriorated into bitterness, fueling her resolve to act. Mark, the husband, unknowingly became the first victim of this macabre plan, as Diana and Rachel began to lace the sports drink he frequently consumed with antifreeze, despite his lack of interest in athletics. His health gradually deteriorated, presenting symptoms akin to a common cold, which failed to raise suspicions among those around him until he tragically never awoke one morning. Originally, Diana's scheme was motivated by the desire to claim insurance money and rid herself of what she considered a parasitic presence in her life. However, the seamless execution of their plan emboldened the duo to contemplate further actions to streamline their living situation. They proceeded to mix tasteless antifreeze into the beverages of Sean and Sarah. Given Sean's already fragile health, the poison took effect more rapidly on him. Recognizing that simultaneous deaths would draw undue attention, they strategically delayed Sarah's intended demise to the following year. Following Diana Stout's shockingly callous confession, she was promptly arrested, and law enforcement secured a search warrant for her residence in Springfield. Within the home, authorities discovered a diary belonging to Rachel, Diana's accomplice and favored daughter, which contained entries that shed further light on their heinous acts. The inaugural entry in Rachel's diary, penned months before Mark's demise, expressed a detached sorrow over the forthcoming deaths of her father and brother Sean. She anticipated the difficulty of adapting to their absence, but remained optimistic about the future. The cold, emotionless tone in which she chronicled these impending losses stunned the investigating officers, prompting them to bring Rachel Stout in for questioning regarding the calamitous occurrences within her family. Initially, Rachel adopted the guise of an ignorant casualty of the situation, but this facade quickly crumbled once detectives confronted her with her diary's contents. Her subsequent account revealed that she was as complicit as her mother, Diana, in the macabre plot to eliminate their family members. Rachel displayed a chilling apathy when discussing their plans, driven not by personal grievances, but by a desire to alleviate her mother's perceived burdens. Rachel's recounting largely mirrored Diana's, albeit with notable discrepancies. Contrary to her mother's claims, Rachel insisted that the scheme extended beyond merely dispatching Mark. While Sean's behavior troubled Diana, Rachel initially opposed targeting her brother, advocating instead for his placement in a care facility. Despite these disagreements, Diana, unwilling to endure the challenges posed by Sean's condition and behavior, proceeded without her daughter's consent, persisting in poisoning him with antifreeze. It took 3 excruciating weeks for Sean to succumb to the effects. Diana observed her son's decline with a chilling indifference, maintaining the lethal regimen until his demise. Rachel professed shock over Sean's death, mirroring their father's fate, which led to a cautious pause before they resumed their plan with Sarah, waiting 9 months before attempting to poison her again. Sarah was depicted by her sister as inherently indolent, showing little interest in contributing financially or assisting with household chores, spending her days watching YouTube videos in her room. Her excessive curiosity was also noted as a contributing factor to her targeted fate. The narrative diverges when discussing Brianne, the youngest daughter. While Diana claimed she harbored no ill intentions towards Brianne, Rachel's account suggested otherwise, indicating plans were in place to deal with Brianne similarly, due to the inconvenience her learning disability posed, with Diana purportedly unwilling to tolerate the challenges it presented. The confessions and subsequent arrests of Diana and Rachel Stout sent shockwaves through their community, leaving acquaintances bewildered by the heinous acts committed by a seemingly devoted nurse and churchgoer. The disparity between the family's public persona, characterized by devout religious postings and inspirational content on social media, and the grim reality of their actions underscored the profound betrayal of trust. The catalyst for the investigation, an anonymous tip, was later revealed to have been sent by Jeff Skippy, the family's pastor, who grew suspicious following the consecutive unexplained deaths within the Stout household. His keen observation and timely intervention with the authorities potentially saved additional lives from being ensnared in the malevolent scheme, orchestrated by two individuals masquerading as pillars of virtue within their community. Sarah, on the brink of death as per medical professionals, astonishingly pulled through. Nonetheless, she was left with a disability for life, enduring severe organ damage and neurological issues due to ingesting antifreeze. Sarah recounted her mother's distress over her returning from university, yet she could never foresee the heinous scheme her closest confidant had in mind. The thought of her mother's actions was beyond her darkest fears. It was later revealed that there were precursors to this tragedy. Shortly before Sarah was hospitalized, she accidentally found her mother's diary following Sham's loss. Within its pages, Diana had written about wanting to harm Sarah. Upon confronting her mother about the diary's contents, Diana simply complained about her privacy being violated. Diana somehow reassured her daughter that her diary entry was not concerning. Without the investigators informing Sarah about her mother's confession to poisoning her, she would have remained oblivious to the betrayal. Diana's younger daughter, Brianna, was examined medically and then placed in a foster home, showing no symptoms of poisoning, thankfully. After rehabilitation, Sarah voiced her perspective on her mother's malevolent intentions. She chose not to view herself as a victim, but rather as someone who overcame adversity. She managed to forgive her mother, not only for the personal harm, but also for the murder of her father and brother, displaying an extraordinary level of forgiveness, since she would now require lifelong care and support. Rachel, seeking to mitigate her punishment, admitted guilt in 2015 to a serious offense and agreed to testify against her mother. Rachel received a life sentence with parole eligibility after 42 years. Diana faced charges of 2 counts of first-degree murder. By pleading, she did not confess guilt but conceded that the evidence against her was overwhelming. Having eliminated 2 family members and incapacitated another, Diana received a life sentence without parole. In prison, Diana soon contested her living conditions and denied responsibility for her husband and son's deaths, even though she had previously discussed plans for their demise. Both Diana and Rachel appealed to withdraw their admissions, with Rachel alleging her lawyer coerced her into making her courtroom statement, and Diana echoing her daughter's claim of coercion. Diane claimed that when Mark became ill, he interacted with suspicious and dangerous individuals, suggesting that they might have been behind his death before he disappeared. Diana claimed that she experienced nausea and digestive problems at the time, portraying herself not as a criminal, but as a casual victim. However, their attempts to present themselves as innocent were rejected. Consequently, both women have sought to simplify their lives by eliminating undesirable family members without ever considering that they themselves may find themselves marginalized in societies locked in places that are not so different from each other.
Brenda Sue Schaefer was born in April 1952 and raised in Louisville, Kentucky, where she encountered her first significant other, Van, during her initial year of high school. The pair quickly became deeply enamored with one another, their bond appearing incredibly tender and innocent initially. They were inseparable and eagerly anticipated their marriage to explore physical closeness. Immediately after graduating, Van proposed to Brenda, who accepted with enthusiasm and excitement. Yet, despite their relationship's outward charm, not everything was as idyllic as it appeared. Brenda was constantly under her family's watchful eye, leading her to be quite naive, purely innocent, and insecure about herself. Moreover, she relied heavily on Van, her boyfriend, who was sociable, active, and notably controlling towards Brenda. He relished his role as the decision-maker in their relationship and appreciated that his girlfriend was gentle and submissive, significantly influencing nearly all her actions. The first major issue the couple encountered post-marriage was a stark sexual incompatibility. Brenda, always reserved and somewhat conventional, and the adventurous Van, who sought excitement and diversity in their intimate life. Brenda started questioning their compatibility,
and whether she could endure her husband's robust nature indefinitely. Raised in a strict Catholic household, divorce was never an option for her, as she was taught by the Catholic Church that married partners should remain together and address challenges jointly, no matter the circumstances. Meanwhile, Van secured a dispatcher position at the Louisville Police Department. Although the salary was modest, it didn't prevent him from indulging and spending liberally on non-essential items, leading to the second major issue: financial disputes and management. Brenda frequently criticized her husband's careless financial habits, adding tension to their union. Additionally, Van began to consume alcohol excessively and use numerous recreational drugs, amplifying Brenda's growing resentment towards him. Nonetheless, truly cherishing his wife and recognizing the dire direction of their relationship, he proposed they seek marital counseling to have a relationship expert address their problems. The duo sought help from a psychotherapist, yet this move made no significant difference in the dynamics between Van and Brenda. After 3 years together, it became painfully clear that their profound incompatibility was insurmountable, and no remedy seemed plausible. Despite Brenda's attempts at moderation, the 4th year was marred by constant toxic squabbles, pettiness, and mutual resentments. Happiness eluded both in their partnership. Brenda started to seriously consider divorce, even discussing it with her parents. Her mother was entirely in favor, whereas her father held a contrary view, arguing that Brenda wasn't putting enough effort into her marital happiness. He voiced his discontent, urging her to persevere and resolve their issues. Nevertheless, Brenda made a final attempt to salvage their marriage, but ultimately chose her own well-being, proceeding with the divorce. The stigma and discomfort of being a divorced woman paled in comparison to the dread of a joyless and toxic union for the rest of her life. Post-divorce, Brenda embraced her independence and singlehood, dedicating herself to her career. It was a while before she was ready to entertain the idea of dating again. However, during a casual visit to a local store, she encountered Jim Rush. Jim was strikingly handsome, full of charm and charisma. A dentist by profession, he showed a sincere interest in Brenda. Encouraged, Brenda decided to take a chance on him, a decision she found no cause to regret. Jim lavished her with presents, offered tenderness and affection, arranged romantic evenings, and conveyed his love for Brenda in myriad ways. In a grand gesture, Jim even leased a billboard near downtown Louisville to publicize his affection, proclaiming the billboard too small to encapsulate his love for her, a move that deeply touched Brenda. The pair frequently journeyed to exotic islands, and occasionally they took holidays alongside Brenda's family. Every family member anticipated that, in time, they would marry. Yet, as was the case initially, not all aspects of their union were as idyllic as they appeared. Jim was revealed to be dependent on alcohol. Having endured a failed marriage previously, Brenda was cautious not to overlook warning signs. Her reservations about wedlock deeply troubled Jim, but evidently it wasn't sufficient to deter his drinking habits. After years of cohabitation, Jim penned a note to Brenda, voicing his disillusionment along with other trivial complaints concerning their partnership, proposing they part ways. Caught off guard by such a development, Brenda was devastated. Despite her reluctance to wed him, she loved him and clung to the hope that Jim would transform into the partner she yearned for. Nevertheless, he showed no inclination to alter his ways. Brenda and her closest confidant, Joyce, shared remarkably parallel romantic entanglements. Both ended relationships with their significant others and resolved to seek companions who were stable, seasoned, financially sound, and of a more advanced age for their next chapter. Joyce led the way by entering a relationship with a man who embodied their ideal. Aiming to aid Brenda in moving past Jim, she introduced her to an acquaintance of her new beau. This gentleman was none other than 48-year-old Melvin Ignatow. Melvin Henry Ignatow, a native of Pennsylvania, was born on March 26, 1938, and later relocated to Louisville for employment opportunities. At the time he met Brenda, he was 14 years her senior, a divorced father of 3, yet he was financially stable and came highly recommended for his stellar personality by his friends.
Joyce, eager to see her friend happy, arranged a double date that included Melvin, encouraging Brenda to simply meet him without any commitment. The group embarked on a maritime excursion, enjoying each other's company immensely. Brenda found herself connecting with Melvin so well that he asked her out for an additional date, this time for just the two of them. Their subsequent meetings only served to deepen their connection, with Melvin showcasing the empathetic, loving nature that Brenda found to be refreshingly genuine and unlike any of her previous relationships. His affluence, manifested in a luxurious home, a yacht, and a stylish sports car, were undeniably appealing. Brenda was less attracted to Melvin physically, but this seemed a minor trade-off given his other attributes. However, she was blissfully unaware of the complex challenges that would emerge later on. Throughout their 2-year union, Melvin's behavior towards Brenda evolved into increasingly possessive and authoritarian, marked by an overprotectiveness that bordered on obsession. He displayed clear signs of possessiveness and narcissism, which did not sit well with Brenda's family, raising serious concerns about his conduct. His habit of incessantly calling Brenda at her workplace to monitor her interactions, especially criticizing her amiability with her colleagues and her superior, led to his unpopularity among her co-workers. When away on international business, Ignatow meticulously scheduled their calls, often ignoring the local time in Louisville, resulting in multiple disruptive calls throughout the night. Yet this was merely a portion of the daily challenges Brenda endured. In their private life, Brenda felt a stark disconnect with Melvin, particularly regarding their sexual compatibility. She disclosed that Ignatow was keen on exploring his sexual fantasies, which included bondage, sensory deprivation, and group activities, all of which Brenda found objectionable. Despite her initial firm refusals, Melvin's persistent coercion led her to reluctantly try to accommodate his desires on a few occasions. His insistence reached a point where he introduced pills, allegedly to enhance her libido without disclosing their nature. Reluctantly, Brenda agreed to take them, only to find herself losing consciousness, later awakening in agony with no recollection of the events that transpired. The recurring episodes of blackout induced fear in Brenda, leaving her deeply concerned about the extent of her partner's willingness to exploit her vulnerability. Brenda confided her anxieties to a friend, who recommended she terminate her relationship. Following this advice, Brenda reached out to her former boyfriend, Jim, revealing her dissatisfaction with Ignatow and detailing the horrific experiences she had suffered. Jim similarly encouraged her to leave him. On September 21, 1988, Brenda contacted Jim to announce that she had ended things with Melvin. She expressed the need to see him one last time to return some jewelry he had given her. Ignatow, both upset and heartbroken over the separation, turned to his previous love, Mary Ann Shore, whom he had been involved with prior to Brenda. Their affair was marked by intense passion, yet the issue was Mary's unreciprocated love for Melvin and her desire to marry him. Nevertheless, Melvin regarded her merely as an outlet for his desires, lacking any emotional attachment or intentions of integrating her into his life on a permanent basis. Contrary to Brenda, Mary was consistently adventurous and eager to engage in whatever Melvin proposed. They sporadically continued their liaison, even during Melvin's time with Schaefer. Mary Ann preserved her intense affection for him, yearning for even minimal recognition. Aware of his involvement with another due to Melvin's transparency, this knowledge led her to resent Brenda deeply. Driven by jealousy, Mary felt she stood no chance of reclaiming his affection as long as Brenda remained a contender. Merely 3 days following Brenda's breakup with Melvin, on September 24th, she vanished. Her automobile was discovered abandoned adjacent to the Interstate 64, with its right tires deflated and a window broken. Although the car radio was gone, the presence of bloodstains on the rear seat was particularly disturbing. Following Brenda's vanishing, her kin and friends, including Melvin, convened at her family home. Melvin, appearing more distraught than the others due to being the last known individual to have been with Brenda, drew suspicion and inquiries about their last encounters. He detailed the day Brenda returned the jewelry,
She fetched him at around 3:30 p.m. They toured the city, relishing their time together, visited the Oxmoor shopping mall, enjoyed a meal, and she left Ignatow at his mother's place close to 11:30 p.m., marking the last moment he saw or communicated with her. Subsequently, Melvin used his mother's vehicle to head to Skyline Chili for another meal, confirmed by the assistant manager who spotted Ignatow there alone around midnight. Questioned about not using his vehicle, Melvin cited mechanical issues, despite arriving in that same car at Brenda's parents' place the next day, raising eyebrows. Additionally, Melvin professed that he and Brenda were happily advancing towards marriage, a claim contradicted by common knowledge. Authorities also suspected Ignatow's role in Brenda's disappearance. Summoned to the precinct, he anticipated needing legal representation and brought along a lawyer friend to assist in the search. During the interrogations, Melvin attempted to steer the discussions, inundating officers with his inquiries while casually addressing them by first names, as though they were acquaintances. As media coverage intensified around Brenda's case, spotlighting the turmoil within her relationship with Melvin and his status as the last person to see her, public and investigative suspicion towards him grew. Melvin found himself in a fervent bid to establish his innocence, with public scrutiny significantly disrupting his routine. He faced accusatory glances and judgments in places as mundane as the post office or supermarket, branded by many as a felon. The authorities found themselves at an impasse. With a prime suspect in sight, they lacked witnesses, a body, and concrete evidence to connect Ignatow to the crime. As months passed, Brenda's fate remained a mystery. Within the U.S. legal framework, a grand jury evaluates the evidence submitted by the prosecution to determine if there's enough basis for a charge. However, the absence of concrete evidence against Ignatow led the prosecutor to offer him an opportunity to testify in his own defense, hoping to clear his name. Despite his attorney's cautions against doing so, Melvin, exhausted by the cloud of suspicion, chose to testify, unintentionally providing the prosecution with valuable information. Ignatow mentioned his former girlfriend, Mary Ann Shore, during his testimony, and he recounted having a chloroform-soaked towel by the bed, allegedly for allergy relief during the night. His discomfort became palpable when discussing the chloroform, puzzled by the prosecutor's insight into such private details of his life. Unbeknownst to him, Brenda had shared her concerns about the chloroform with her loved ones, fearing Melvin might use it on her as she slept. Seeking to sway the grand jury, Ignatow expressed suicidal thoughts, stating his despondence over Brenda's disappearance had robbed him of his will to live, with only his religious faith keeping him from self-harm. He lamented the emotional toll taken by media scrutiny and described feeling persecuted by the general public. The prosecutor found Melvin's account credible and compelling until he claimed his alibi on the night of Brenda's disappearance was his presence with Shore. This claim piqued the prosecution's curiosity, prompting them to summon Shore as a witness, leading the case in an unexpected and startling direction. Mary Ann Shore was ill-prepared for her courtroom appearance and showed visible signs of nervousness when questioned about her acquaintance with Brenda. Her attempt to respond resulted in a confused mix of statements, leading her to abruptly exit the courtroom in distress and tears. It took a while for her to regain composure and come back. Observing that Mary's conduct was exacerbating her situation, her attorney suggested a plea bargain to circumvent a protracted incarceration. Shore consented and unveiled the grim reality behind Brenda Schaefer's fate. Melvin Ignatow had meticulously orchestrated the scheme days prior to Brenda's vanishing. He shared with Mary a checklist of items necessary for restraining and tormenting Brenda. Shore consented to Ignatow carrying out his scheme at her residence. They even performed a test to check if screams were audible from outside by having Mary scream inside a room while Ignatow verified from the street. They also excavated a sizable pit in the backyard, meant for Schaefer's burial. The night Brenda drove him to Mary Ann Shore's home, Ignatow disrobed Schaefer, secured her to a glass coffee table, and savagely attacked her repeatedly. The agony persisted for hours, with Shore capturing the ordeal on camera. Ultimately, after subduing Schaefer with chloroform, they wrapped her body in rope,
encased it in a trash bag, and interred it. This disclosure stunned all attendees. They had suspected Melvin of involvement in Brenda's disappearance, but were not ready for the macabre specifics. Following his arrest, Ignatow's bail was fixed at $500,000. Forensic experts excavated the makeshift burial site in Mary Ann Shore's backyard, finding Schaefer's remains exactly as Shore had depicted, confirming her account. Brenda had been buried in the moist soil for 16 months. The search for the photos that would corroborate Ignatow's guilt ensued, yet they remained elusive. The trial was relocated to Kenton County to mitigate juror prejudice. Even though Brenda's remains were discovered and Mary admitted her involvement, no direct physical proof linked Melvin to the act. Ignatow's legal team contended that his participation was purely conjectural, suggesting Mary might have acted independently, driven by envy towards Brenda. Mary's behavior in court was peculiar, marked by laughter and grimaces, diminishing the gravity of the trial. Her apparent lack of guilt led jurors to question her honesty, while Ignatow consistently refuted any complicity. After a brief 2-hour deliberation, the jury acquitted Melvin of all accusations. Despite 9 out of 12 jurors suspecting Ignatow performed the acts Mary Ann depicted, the lack of concrete evidence led to his discharge from custody on December 23, 1991. Distressed by the verdict, the presiding judge personally extended an apology to Brenda's kin, lamenting the judicial system's inadequacy. Financially drained by his defense, Melvin liquidated nearly all his assets to afford his legal expenses. Mary Ann, sentenced to 5 years, was granted early release after serving 3 due to commendable conduct. Nonetheless, her demise at 58 followed a series of health complications, marking a sorrowful conclusion to her life. In subsequent years, Ignatow's property's new proprietors unearthed a concealed cache within the floorboards during refurbishments, revealing Brenda's ornaments and rolls of undeveloped film depicting Melvin's maltreatment of her. Yet, legal constraints prevented his retrial for the identical offense, even with the emergence of this evidence. He faced perjury charges for his court lies about not murdering Brenda Schaefer. Upon confessing to his deceit, he received a minimum of 8 years imprisonment. Despite expressing regret to the Schaefers and asserting Brenda's last moments were devoid of suffering, his appeals for sentence reduction were rejected. Confronted with an additional federal perjury charge, he incurred a further 9-year penalty. Melvin completed his sentence, obtaining release in December 2006. About 2 years later, on December 1, 2008, at the age of 70, a glass coffee table accident occurred at his residence, marking the end of his life, almost 2 decades after Brenda Schaefer's death. But justice was restored. Late in the evening, on November 15, 1884, a 20-year-old man named John Henry George Lee was assisting his sister Elizabeth in clearing the table in the dining room of an English manor where they both worked. John was the butler, and his sister Elizabeth was the cook. The manor itself was called Glen, and it was located in a beautiful spot on the seacoast in the village of Babbacombe, England. Many years ago, Glen had been much more magnificent. At one point, even the King and Queen of England had come to stay there, but quite recently, the estate and the family who owned it had fallen on hard times. The adult children had moved away, and the head of the household had passed away suddenly. Only the elderly lady of the house remained at the manor. The staff had been reduced to a small team consisting of just the butler John, the cook, his sister Elizabeth, and 2 elderly maids. This meant that virtually all the physical labor fell on the shoulders of John, the only man in the house. That evening they had cleaned up after a dinner party at Glen, to which the lady of the house had invited very important lawyers and politicians. Now, late at night, John was lugging a huge pile of heavy china from the dining room to the kitchen. At the same time, he was trying to talk to his sister, who was also engaged in washing dishes. But the young woman stubbornly pretended not to hear him and simply did not react at all. While John was carrying dozens of plates at a time, Elizabeth was taking and carrying only a few pieces. This irritated the man. Not only was his sister not helping, but she was also ignoring him. This continued until the woman herself approached him. Elizabeth apologized, and blamed it on feeling unwell. John noticed his sister instinctively placing her hands on her stomach and realized that she was pregnant. Just a minute ago, John had been about to get angry at her behavior, but now he understood why she had been acting that way. It should be understood that the woman had not told her brother or anyone else in the house about her condition for a reason. The fact was that the owners of Glen were very religious people and held traditional beliefs. Pregnancy out of wedlock was a sin. Elizabeth was not married at the time. In England, it was considered abnormal to have children out of wedlock. It was an absolute taboo. Despite all the woman's efforts to conceal the pregnancy, John and the two other elderly maids very quickly realized what was happening, because every morning they heard Elizabeth retching due to morning sickness. They tried to support her in every way, but the woman categorically refused to acknowledge the fact of her pregnancy. Remembering this, John sent his sister to rest, reassuring her that he could handle the dishes on his own. He didn't even know who the father of the future child was, since Elizabeth refused to talk to anyone about it. But neither he nor the two other maids wanted the lady of the house to find out about her condition and fire the girl. By 11 p.m., John had almost finished all his chores and was exhausted. He was about to go to bed when one of the elderly maids entered the kitchen and informed him that it was time for the nightly prayer. The butler put aside the silverware he was polishing without hesitation and followed the maid to the living room, where the owner of Glen was already waiting for them in her nightgown. The mistress, a 68-year-old lady named Emma Kesey, enjoyed conducting nightly prayers with her staff. She felt that in this way she was taking care of the servants and the salvation of their souls. In fact, John was not a very religious man, but to please Emma, he agreed to perform these nightly prayers. The reason for such an arrangement was that the mistress had essentially saved him several times. John had started working for Emma 6 years ago when he was only 14. He was a difficult teenager, a rude troublemaker, but for some reason, the woman had a soft spot for him. John Henry George Lee, the son of a small farmer, was born in 1864 in Abbots Kerswell, a small village in southern England, and getting to Glen was a kind of achievement for him. When John confessed to his mistress that he dreamed of traveling the world, Emma helped him enlist in the British Royal Navy, and for 2 years the young man served in the military and was indeed able to see the world. He dreamed of staying in the service for as long as possible, but one day he caught a very bad cold and fell ill with pneumonia. The illness negatively affected John's health. He was deemed unfit to continue military service and was forced to leave the army prematurely. Upon returning home due to his health condition, John had no idea what to do next. He had planned to stay in the Navy much longer and was now completely at a loss. Due to the weakness that remained after the pneumonia, he could not engage in heavy physical labor in the village and became a burden to his parents. Fortunately, it was at this moment that Emma Kesey intervened. She gave the young man a glowing recommendation, and one of her wealthy friends agreed to hire John Lee as a domestic servant. The young man was immensely happy that he had some purpose in life again, but his happiness was short-lived. Out of stupidity, he made a mistake. He stole an expensive plate from his master. John had not yet figured out what he was going to do with the stolen treasure when the owner of the estate noticed the loss. And he didn't just scold the young man and make him return the item, but involved the police. Ultimately, John Lee ended up in jail for theft, was held behind bars for 6 months, and when he was released, he was sure that now no one would hire him with such a reputation. And again, for the 3rd time, Emma intervened in the young man's fate. This woman believed that people should be forgiven and given a chance to redeem themselves. Otherwise, once a person had stumbled, they could go down the wrong path. The woman, who had recently lost her husband, understood that now positive recommendations would not save John, so she offered him to return to Glen and work for her. She was just in need of a butler at the time. John could not believe it. He knew he did not deserve a second chance, especially from Emma, whom he had let down so badly by stealing an expensive item in her friend's house. From the bottom of his heart, thanking his savior, he swore that he would do everything in his power to make sure she did not regret her decision. And so far, everything had been just that. John tried his best to please Emma, and if these nightly prayers with the servants were so important to her, then it was not at all difficult for him to pretend that they brought him joy as well. So that evening, John entered the dining room as usual, sat down next to his mistress, and prepared to perform the daily ritual. After Elizabeth and the two other elderly maids had taken their places at the table, everyone joined hands and bowed their heads, and Emma began to recite the prayer. As soon as the event was over, the maids went to the kitchen to prepare a cup of hot cocoa for their mistress. The woman usually went to bed very, very late, when all the other inhabitants of the manor were already asleep. Before going to bed, Emma loved to drink hot cocoa, sitting by the burning fireplace, and read or write letters. She enjoyed being alone with herself. The maids left, and John also wished his mistress good night and walked to the pantry next to the kitchen, which also served as his bedroom. Having made his bed, the young man crawled under the covers and immediately fell asleep, as the fatigue accumulated during the day took its toll. Around 3:30 in the morning, John was awakened by someone's screams. Rubbing his eyes and yawning, he ran out of the pantry and saw that the entire kitchen was filled with smoke. Through the smoke screen, he could make out his sister Elizabeth and one of the maids. They were screaming, calling for his help. It was necessary to urgently evacuate everyone from the premises and at the same time somehow try to extinguish the fire. John instantly rushed upstairs to his mistress's room. He felt that Emma might have encountered problems and wanted to save her. Running up the stairs to the second floor, he ran into the second maid, who looked completely crazy. The woman, sincerely worried, informed the butler that she had just been in the mistress's bedroom and could not find her there.
Emma's bed was completely engulfed in flames, so the maid could not see whether the bed was empty or whether the owner of the estate was lying there. Realizing the full horror of the situation, the servants in full force rushed for buckets. Having filled them with water, they rushed to the mistress's bedroom to try to extinguish the fire that was rapidly spreading in Emma's chambers. But by the time they got upstairs, the flames had already spread further and were blocking the entrance to the bedroom like a wall. So there was no way to pass through it, and their small buckets of water were of no help. As much as the servants wanted to save their mistress, they had no choice. Unfortunately, they could do nothing against the raging flames. They had to leave her to perish in the fire. Having made the difficult decision, the four of them turned around and ran downstairs so as not to be burned alive. Running past the dining room on the first floor, the maid and the butler saw Emma lying on the floor. The servants, without even approaching closely, immediately realized from her mutilated body that the mistress was dead, and it was not the fire that was to blame. The terrible wounds on Emma's head indicated that she had clearly been hacked to death. Her neck was cut so deeply that it seemed as if someone had tried to rip her head off. John Lee, Elizabeth, and the two maids just stood there in shock, staring at Emma, not even knowing what to do. Then one of the maids, apparently realizing that a crime had been committed, screamed with all her might and rushed outside. The other inhabitants of the house followed her. Several neighbors, local fishermen, and Coast Guard personnel were able to jointly extinguish the fire at Glen. But it was not just a fire. It was a clear attempt to conceal a brutal murder. When the police arrived at the scene, suspicion immediately fell on John. This story took place long before data obtained from forensic laboratories began to be used in investigations. At that time, due to the lack of concrete evidence, law enforcement officers drew conclusions based on their own reasoning, intuition, inner feelings, and assumptions. The detectives quickly determined that whoever had taken Emma Kesey's life and inflicted those terrible wounds on her must have possessed considerable physical strength. Since John Lee was the only man in the house that night and, accordingly, the strongest, compared to the other female residents of the estate, he must have been the perpetrator. Moreover, a small fresh cut was found on his hand. The police also found bloody footprints under the debris of the burned furniture, indicating that Emma had been attacked not in the living room, but in the corridor near the stairs, which was not far from the pantry where John slept. And a bloody axe and knife were found practically right outside the pantry door. In addition to all this, The investigators established that the fire had been set deliberately. The arsonist had doused the entire house with flammable oil, which was stored in the pantry where John Lee slept. Considering all the evidence found, the butler was arrested on the same day that the fire occurred at Glen Manor, and when the mistress of the house, Emma Kesey, died. Moreover, he already had a criminal record for theft, so, in the opinion of the police, everything pointed to him. The next day, while John Lee was in a prison cell, a warden suddenly appeared at the door and informed him that a lawyer had come to see him. John was confused because he had no means to afford a lawyer and had no idea where one could have come from. Despite the prisoner's bewilderment, the guard opened the cell door and ordered John to proceed to the interrogation room. There, John was met by a well-dressed, respectable man who was sitting at a table and leafing through some papers. The butler was not actually personally acquainted with this man, but he had heard about him and had repeatedly seen him at Glen Manor as a guest. It was just unclear why he had suddenly decided to defend a simple lackey who had nothing to pay him for his efforts. This man's name was Reginald Templar, and he was a very successful lawyer who was highly respected in the area. He also turned out to be one of Emma's closest friends. Why Reginald Templar, a friend of the deceased woman, was going to defend the lackey who was accused of murdering her remained a mystery both to John and to the prison staff. It simply made no sense.
Eventually, Reginald gestured for his client to sit in the chair and asked him to recount everything he remembered about the evening before the tragedy unfolded. Reginald expressed his confidence that the butler had nothing to do with the death of his benefactress. This gave John hope, and feeling some relief, he began to talk about the events of that terrible day. During the conversation, Reginald took notes, clarified some things, and right there began to create the basis for John Lee's defense. Finding himself back in his cell, the butler felt an incredible surge of energy. With Reginald's help, he really had a chance to be saved from the baseless accusation. However, John's relief was short-lived. The first court appearance went great. Reginald appeared in his fashionable suit, confident in himself, and tore the prosecution's case to shreds. Reginald pointed out to the prosecutor that all the evidence was circumstantial and literally far-fetched. John didn't understand much of what his lawyer was saying. All these legal precedents that the lawyer was discussing were far from the things John was used to. But he could see that the judge was impressed. Reginald said that the police had done a terrible job of investigating the crime, making overly hasty conclusions. The prosecutor looked very nervous at that moment, and John was already genuinely feeling confident about his imminent release. Further court proceedings were postponed. If it had continued in the same rhythm as the first one, it is possible that John would have been released right in the courtroom. But on the second day, Reginald simply did not appear in court without any explanation and did not attempt to contact anyone. John Lee, not understanding what had happened, just sat and waited. He didn't know what the judge did in such cases, and the judge, as best he could, postponed the start of the session, then threw up his hands, looked at John, and said that he was very sorry, but now the defendant would have to defend himself on his own. The clerk announced the start of the trial. Of course, John Lee was not ready for such a turn of events. Not only had he never studied law, he hadn't even gone to school. Therefore, from the second day of the trial, things only got worse for the butler, because Reginald continued to miss sessions without any explanation. And if he did appear in court, he would start unnecessary debates with the prosecutor and the judge over issues completely unrelated to the case, which only increased suspicion against John Lee. He was no longer the astute lawyer, but behaved like some kind of maniac. For example, reprimanding the judge about his hairstyle, but not wanting to discuss the real case at all. During the testimony of witnesses, Reginald also behaved strangely. Instead of asking questions on the merits, Reginald was interested in what they had for breakfast or what their favorite color was. The line of questioning made absolutely no sense. Eventually, Reginald simply abandoned the case, leaving John without any defense at all. Although, by general admission, he did him a favor with this act, since another lawyer, upon learning about this, felt sorry for John Lee and volunteered to represent the butler's interests in court. Given that the new lawyer didn't even have time to properly prepare for the trial,
his good intentions could not save the defendant from a guilty verdict. Due to the lack of experience, the lawyer was unable to win the case. The jury, having heard the witnesses, the prosecutor, and the defense, went to deliberate. It took them less than an hour to come to a unanimous decision and return with a verdict: guilty. John Henry George Lee was sentenced to death by hanging. For the next 3 months, the butler spent his time in a prison cell, terrified, awaiting execution. All this time, he insisted on his innocence and shouted that God would protect him from an unjust sentence. Finally, on February 23, 1885, the day of John's execution arrived. For most people, it was just an ordinary day, except that the execution never took place. The executioner, a man named James Barry, had sent criminals to the other world for many years. He had checked the gallows and the trapdoor where the villain falls through after the sentence is read, and the signal for the execution to begin, in advance as required. Everything functioned precisely, like clockwork. John Lee appeared before a crowd of onlookers eager to see the murderer who had killed the elderly mistress of Glen Manor give up his soul to God. John prayed for the last time, remembering how Emma had taught him to do it, closing his eyes. The priest, standing on the scaffold not far from the gallows, also finished his ritual. When all the preparations were completed, a bag was put over John's head and a rope around his neck. He was led to the trapdoor and the executioner pulled the lever. The spectators, holding their breath, waited for the criminal's last whimper and the crunch of breaking vertebrae. But nothing happened. The trapdoor did not open. The executioner looked at the gallows in bewilderment, not understanding what was happening. As soon as John and the priest were led away from the trapdoor in the floor and asked to go downstairs, the structure opened. Everything was working fine. They decided to start the execution again. The butler was asked to say his last words. The bag was pulled over his head, the noose, and he was led to the trapdoor. The priest prayed again for the salvation of the soul of God's servant. The executioner pulled the lever, and again nothing happened. As soon as John Lee stood on the trapdoor, said goodbye to life, the gallows stopped working. The crowd began to cross themselves and whisper. The execution device was checked again for malfunctions, but the gallows were in order, and it seemed that nothing could prevent justice from being carried out. For the third time, John Lee was led to the scaffold. For the third time, he was prepared for execution. For the third time, he said goodbye to life and again remained unharmed. In the end, after the third failure, it was decided to cancel the execution. It was up to the judge to decide what to do with the prisoner who could not be hanged 3 times. Trying to execute John a 4th time would be inhumane. Therefore, the death sentence against him was commuted to life imprisonment, which lasted only 22 years. From prison, the unjustly convicted butler continued to write petitions to the judge to review the case due to his innocence, and on September 18, 1907, John Henry George Lee was finally released for good behavior. None of this made any sense until one day, 6 years after Emma Kesey's death, the bitter truth was revealed. More precisely, it became known much later. By that time, John was still serving his sentence in a prison cell, and everyone had long forgotten about him. In 1890, a group of people from high society, including politicians, lawyers, and other wealthy individuals, gathered at a cemetery near Glen Manor to say goodbye to a very important and respected man who had died after slowly going insane. When the priest finished the funeral rite, the mourners threw a few handfuls of earth into the grave and slowly began to disperse. Someone from the gathered whispered to another that perhaps today they had buried a criminal. Here is what, in the opinion of many, actually happened on the night of November 15, 1884, when Emma Kesey was brutally murdered. Elizabeth's pregnancy, John Lee's sister, could have turned into a scandal not only for herself, but also for the father of her unborn child. He was also worried about his reputation and nervous about what society would think when they found out about his child out of wedlock, especially with someone else's maid. Only Elizabeth knew who this man was, but despite the threat of exposure,
the father of the future baby did not want to give up his meetings with the pretty girl. He did not try to distance himself from Elizabeth in any way, but continued to sneak into her room when everyone was asleep. On that fateful night after the dinner party at Glen, which he also attended, the child's father decided to sneak into the manor under the cover of darkness to see his pregnant lover. Emma, the mistress of the estate, was still awake, although she had long since dismissed the servants. She was sitting in the living room, drinking cold cocoa and rereading old letters when she heard someone's cautious steps in the corridor. The woman put down the letter, placed the half-empty cup on the table, and went to see who was walking around at such a late hour. In the hallway, Emma came face to face with a man she had known for many years. He was coming out of the bedroom of the young cook, Elizabeth. Her religious and conservative nature could not tolerate such audacity. The woman instantly understood everything. She was so offended and angry that she started yelling at the night guest. The mistress threatened to tell the whole world about his escapades and illicit affair if he did not leave her house immediately and forget the way there, and then Emma approached the man and gave him a loud slap. At this moment, the face of the uninvited guest was distorted with malice. He snarled and flew into a rage. Instead of leaving, he started attacking Emma, and then grabbed an axe hanging on the wall near the pantry and brought it down right on the mistress's head. She collapsed to the floor as if cut down, but was still breathing and continued to silently gasp for air. Seeing the blood on his hands, the man came to his senses and realized what he had done. He understood that now his secret would be revealed. He would fall out of favor with society and lose his job. Even worse, he would go to jail for assaulting a person. Emma Kesey had to die to take his secret with her. In a moment of panic, the perpetrator ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and finished his dirty work, finally knocking the spirit out of Emma Kesey. When she stopped showing signs of life, the man dragged her body back to the dining room where she usually read before bed. Then he doused the entire house with flammable oil, which was stored in the pantry where John slept, and started a fire to cover up the traces of the crime. The man didn't even notice the sleeping butler when he grabbed the oil from the shelf. Then the murderer ran out of the house, and for the next 6 years was tormented by the realization of the gravity of his wrongdoing. He suffered so much from having taken the life of his friend Emma Kesey that he almost sent Elizabeth and his unborn child to the next world as well. He began to go insane. Mental health problems led to a deterioration in his physical health. He stopped eating, getting up, recognizing his loved ones. As he lay on his deathbed, the man began to rave about things that had occupied his thoughts for the past 6 years. He spoke of the terrible death of a woman close to him who lived in a large, beautiful estate by the sea, of a fire that consumed the traces of the crime, of his child who was to be born. In essence, he confessed to the murder of Emma Kesey. His family and friends heard this, but it took them a while to connect the dying man's delirium with real events in his life. That's why people at his funeral were whispering, calling him a murderer. This man was none other than the lawyer Reginald Templar. Now no one will ever know whether he took on John Lee's case because he felt guilty and wanted to keep an innocent man out of prison, or whether he simply wanted to sabotage the case to have guarantees that he himself would not end up behind bars. Although it was during this trial that Reginald began to fall into the madness that ultimately led to his death. There are several different versions regarding John Lee's extraordinary escape from the gallows. Of course, the most religious and trusting people considered it divine intervention for wanting to hang an innocent man. God did not allow another crime to be committed, but this was nothing more than an illusion. There was another version related to God's providence. Only the Holy Father, who accompanied the criminal on the scaffold, unwittingly acted as the savior. When building the gallows, the carpenter accidentally broke one board. When pressure was applied to it, it blocked the latch mechanism, preventing it from working. When the priest ascended the scaffold during the execution and stood in his designated place, it created pressure on the broken board, and it jammed the entire structure. When testing the mechanism, the clergyman descended from the scaffold and the trapdoor opened freely. Thus, divine intervention consisted only in the fact that the Holy Father, without knowing it, was blocking the hatch. Another reason why the gallows malfunctioned every time John stood on the wooden doors was that when the scaffold was moved from one place to another, the drawbar was slightly displaced. As a result, the loops of the hatch got stuck when they were pressed by a weight. And there were several such versions. An alternative theory suggested that the trap was blocked by a wooden wedge that was inserted by an inmate working on the scaffold and removed when the device was tested, but confirmation of this theory was not found. Some said that John knew about the mistake of the carpenter who made the scaffold. If you stand on it in a certain way, the flaps will not open. Others argued that the wooden trap doors had swollen slightly from moisture. When someone stood on them, they would jam, but if there was no weight, they would open easily. Based on the story of the lawyer Reginald Templar, John was indeed an innocent man and did not deserve to die. Having spent 22 years in prison, John Lee became famous as a man who could not be hanged. After his release, the former prisoner even performed in public several times, telling about his life. A silent film was made about his divine salvation from the gallows. A book was written about this incredible case, and even a rock opera was created where the main character miraculously avoids being hanged 3 times. Information about John Lee's whereabouts after 1916 varies slightly in different sources. There is documentary evidence that after his release from prison, John Lee married and emigrated to America, where he lived a happy and peaceful life until he died at the age of 81. The case, where thanks to some amazing coincidence, a person sentenced to death was able to stay alive, has gone down in the history of the crime genre.